Hello, Tim. Welcome to Travel Daily's Airline Distribution Conference in Shanghai. I would like to ask you about um, the massive undertakings which airlines are preparing for, which is digital transformation. But at the same time, airlines have a lot of industry-specific issues. So where do we stand today in terms of the transformation we are talking about?
Thank you, Ritesh. It's a very interesting question. So if you look at the world for digital transformation it's here. People have gone digital. The organizations, however, are full of organic material called humans, and humans don't understand digital as well as perhaps they might. But I think the transformation that has occurred in general life, never mind industry, has been driven by organizations such as Alibaba in China, the equivalent of Amazon in the rest of the world. That transformation has occurred in the minds of the consumer. The minds of the consumer is, am I going to buy a product where I walk out the door and go and buy my pizza by getting on my bike and walking down to the store 10 minutes away? Or am I just going to go online on my mobile and just order my pizza that way? That transformation has already occurred. The problem was that the technical infrastructure of corporations wasn't led to that same capability. When you bring that down to an airline specific issue, the problem with airlines, maybe not so bad in China because China is still relatively new, and a lot of the designs and structures of organizations in China are not necessarily encumbered with the same set of legacy. They still have some legacy, but the same set of legacy as, say, the US carriers and the European carriers. So endemic inside an airline has been, what is their number one mission? It's always safety. What's the number two mission is operational efficiency. The consumer comes way down after the pilots, the fuel, and government regulation. You're talking about the consumer doesn't even appear in the hierarchy of an airline until about 6 or 7 down in the list of priorities. So nobody has really actually made the consumer the real focus of an airline because of this operational set of issues. And that's understandable. Would you prefer marketing or would you prefer to have a safe aircraft? That's a no-brainer.
So Tim, is it time to separate operation from digital? The e-commerce team needs to have...
No, I think they are inextricably linked because at the same time that the consumer side has gone down, is approaching digital transformation. The digital transformation has already occurred largely in the other parts of the aircraft. The aircrafts themselves are digital. They've gone from being hydraulic to electrically driven. Now they're completely digital. So when you see, say, a new Boeing 787 or an Airbus A350, they are very digital aircraft. They have buses in place. They are all digital. Now, let me give an example of something that has gone digital. It used to be called what they call the flight bag. So flight bags today, if you had all the paper, it's about 20 kilos of paper that you'd have to carry around with you if you're a pilot. But you can put all that on a tablet and have it on a tablet. So that's what they have with these things called electronic flight bags. But when you look at the consumer and the consumer touch points, look at how many different touch points and the variations of those touch points that exist between the consumer and the ultimate source, which is the airline itself. I always like to say there is a very key question. The key question is, how did the customer get to the jetway? Never mind anything else. That's the point from which you must start, and that must be digital. In the past, that used to be the end of the transaction that was completely separated. But now the line between where the jetway starts and stops and the consumer and all his interaction has been blurred. So now the customer can engage into a process actually on the aircraft, and he can take his experience, his digital experience, his digital persona, if you like, on board the aircraft. So the nature of airlines is they've gone away from being just purely a whole bunch of different silos. So there's something called distribution, there's something called marketing, there's something called customer service, to this, here is how I engage you as the customer. So instead of the customer having to come to the different silos of the airline and touch it different ways, the airline is having to transform and go around the other way and say, how do I engage with you and touch you? Now, some of the airlines are doing a really good job at this. Emirates is a good example that made the customer and all the customer touch points a key part of their impact project. In China, that is relatively new to transformation of any sort because they didn't need to. They were still growing fast and built on designs which were from the 70s and 80s and 90s rather than some of this legacy stuff that went back to the 1920s in the designs of tickets. So they didn't have the need. Now China is having to wake up and is seeing a different world emerge because the world of digital in China is very different from the world of digital in the rest of the world. If you like, in the United States, for example, the US is still not caught up in China. China is no longer following the rest of the world. The rest of the world should now sit up and pay attention to China. Because in China, the concept of a meta search and an OTA and something else is completely different. So you have things like Fliggy. Fliggy would not have a concept or an opposite number in the United States. Expedia is not Fliggy, right? So what has happened now is China has emerged with different models, far more digitally enhanced and created an engagement with the customer. In the US, we don't have that. And in Europe, Western Europe, we don't have that. So the rest of the world should sit up and pay attention to what is actually occurring in China.
So what is there for non-Chinese airlines to learn from Chinese airlines? Because Alibaba is an ecosystem, Tencent is an ecosystem. What is there for carriers across the world to learn from China as these carriers are also dealing with ecosystem which don't allow anything to go out of their ecosystem?
Yes, that's a very good question. The lessons to be learned are that first of all you need to move away from I am going to protect all my data. My data is so sacred and that I can't possibly share that data with you. China's political system is different from the rest of the world's political system, yet their commercial system is not necessarily dictated by their political system, which happens in other countries. So what you have is a very freewheeling form of electronic commerce, e-commerce if you like, or pure digital commerce as we prefer to say, than in the rest of the world. So some of the restrictions that exist in the rest of the world could easily be removed if people took the same attitude as the Chinese and pragmatic nature of how the Chinese have dealt with regulation, for example. But I think the key lesson to be learned is, look, this is how you understand that your customer is not just your customer alone. He's a whole lot of other people's customers. And that relationship, as opposed to I hate to say this, but I would say that the US carriers go, that's my customer and only my customer. Whereas a Chinese airline will say, I would like to talk to my customer through Fliggy. There's a completely different attitude there from those carriers.
So you mean to say OTAs here work in a collaborative manner with the airlines, or?
No, because you've got to be careful here. Fliggy is not an OTA. So does Delta want to talk to its customers through Expedia? Absolutely not. They want to talk to their customers only through Delta and only in a Delta world. Whereas in China, the Chinese carriers recognize that when you're in if you're a Tencent customer and you are talking via WeChat, then that's the relationship that we have with you. It's part of the infrastructure. It's not going to get in the way. In fact, it's an enabler of the dialogue and the conversation, the relationship that you have. The same with Fliggy as part of the Alibaba network. So I think that is a fundamental difference, that American carriers still think of protectionism and control, whereas everybody else is a lot more, I wouldn't say collaborative, you've got to be very careful about that, because I don't think there is necessarily a need to be collaborative, but there is a need to be facilitated,
right.
And that's where the difference is. I think that the Chinese digital transformation has enabled greater forms of facilitation than the facilitation in other parts of the world.
Thanks, Tim, for your time.
You're welcome.